1, 2, 3. Hi guys, we're talking about tide again today. We're just going to talk a little bit more specifically about what happens during tides. So this is the vocabulary that you're going to need to know by the end of this lesson. It's important, so make sure that you have a good range for this vocabulary. Write it down, somehow make sure that you know this vocabulary. Okay, so flood tide is occurring when the tide is coming in. So from low tide to high tide is called flood tide. Ebb tide is occurring when the tide is going out. That's from high tide to low tide. The tidal range is the difference between the lowest and the highest tides of the day. So you did this a little bit on your lab yesterday. Some places only have one tide, one low tide. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Some places have one low tide and one high tide per day. That's called diurnal tides. Other places have 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day, approximately equal in size, and that is called semi-diurnal tides. And then if the 2 high and low tides of semi-diurnal tides are unequal, they're called a mixed semi-diurnal tide. So our coast has a semi-diurnal tide, and it is pretty much equal in size. So different types of tides that we want to look at. First of all, the spring tide. The spring tide happens when the moon is full or new. The gravitational pull of the moon and the sun are combined, and at these times, the high tides are very, very high, and the low tides are very, very low. It's known as the spring tide. Spring tides are especially strong, and they have nothing to do with the spring season. They occur when the Earth, the sun, and the moon are in the line, and they occur during the full moon and the new moon. The spring tide typically has a tidal range that's very large. It's a large, large tidal range. So a neap tide occurs when the sun and the moon are at a right angle with the Earth. This is during the moon's quarter phases. The sun and the moon are at these right angles, and they're causing bulges to kind of cancel each other out. The result of it is a smaller difference between the high and low tides, and it's known as neap. I always say neap is little, neap. Neap tides are especially weak tides. They occur when the gravitational forces of the moon are perpendicular to one another with respect to the Earth. Neap tides occur during the quarter moon. And remember that the tidal range is very small with a neap tide. Neap. Why is the moon's pull greater than the sun? It's very important if I keep asking it. It's because the moon is closer to the Earth than the sun. So some tidal phenomenon, different types of tides that you need to know about. Sometimes the front of a rising tide propagates a river that's going up. Pause. 1, 2, 3. So we're going to look at some tidal phenomenon. The first one we're looking at is called a tide bore. Sometimes the front of the tide will move up a river, and it's kind of like funneling all that water up a river. And it causes a tumbling wall of water that advances up the river, and it's breaking surf that's riding up the river. And this one happens to be, I believe, in the Amazon, and they surf it coming in. So creation of a bore requires a large rise of the tide at the mouth of the river, sometimes sandbars. Sometimes there's restrictions that kind of impede the advance. And the water can't spread uniformly over that vast, shallow interior of the river, so it can't match that rapid rise. Friction at the base of that, plus the resistance from the last ebb flow, it leaves the river causing a top of the advancing front to tumble forward, sometimes giving the bore an appearance of a traveling waterfall. Okay, the next one we want to look at is a rip tide. Do not confuse a rip tide with a rip current. They are completely different things. But a rip tide is a powerful current caused by the tide pulling water through an inlet along a barrier beach. When there is a falling or an ebbing tide, the water flows strongly through the inlet towards the ocean, especially one that's been stabilized by jetties. This occurs on the Outer Banks a lot. If you look down at Rudy Inlet, sometimes you can see this happening. A storm surge. Storm surge is an abnormal rise of water that's generated by a storm, and it's over and above what we predict the tide to be. Storm surge is not confused with storm tide. Storm tide is the water level rise due to the combination of storm surge and the tide. The rise of the water level can cause extreme flooding in coastal areas, especially here, when the storm coincides with normal high tide. It can result in storm tides reaching up to 20 feet or more in some cases. The largest I've ever seen here was 4 feet. There's also kind of a strange phenomenon known as a negative storm surge. During Hurricane Irma in 2017, that's what dried out areas of the shoreline in Florida that are normally underwater, and it left a whole lot of manatees stranded on the land. Okay, tidal zones. There are several tidal zones. It's called the intertidal zone, the area between the high tides and the low tide. It's harsh, it's unforgiving, it's subject to the rigors of both the sea and the land, but it has 4 distinct physical subdivisions that you need to know about. And they're based on the amount of exposure to the water and to the air that each one gets. So the first, the tallest, the highest one is called the spray zone. And then we have the high, middle, and lower intertidal zones. Each subzone has its own characteristic and has its own distinct biological community. The spray zone's probably more a part of the land than it is the ocean. It's only submerged during rare, very high tides or severe storms, but it's repeatedly wetted by the splash of the waves and the wind-blown spray. The high intertidal zone is flooded during peaks of the once or twice daily high tides, and it's out of water for long stretches in between in the low tides. The middle intertidal zone is generally submerged, except for fairly short periods during the turn of the low tide. And the lower intertidal zone is exposed only during the lowest spring tides. So, challenges to organisms that are living in those intertidal zones. There are a bunch of them, but these are the top 4 that you do need to know about. So, moisture. There's usually 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day, at least on the East Coast. Depending on the time of day, different areas of the intertidal zone may be wet or dry. Organisms have to be able to adapt if they're left high and dry when the tide goes out. Sea snails, like periwinkles, have a trapdoor called an operculum that they can close when they're out of the water to keep the moisture in. Okay, waves is another challenge. In some areas, waves hit the intertidal zone with force, and marine animals and plants have to be able to protect themselves. Kelp, a type of algae, has a root-like structure called a holdfast that uses it to attach to rocks or mussels, thus keeping it in place. Okay, salinity. Remember, that's a measure of the salt in the water. Depending on rainfall, the water in the intertidal zone may be more or less salty, and tide pool organisms have to adapt to the increases or decreases in salt throughout the day. And then we have temperature. As the tide goes out, tide pools and shallow areas in the intertidal become more vulnerable to temperature changes, and they can occur from increased sunlight or even colder weather. Some tide pool animals hide under plants in the tide pool to find shelter from the sun. So, tides affect marine life. It's adapt or die. Being able to adapt is a matter of life or death. In a perfect world, organisms wouldn't need to adapt. However, changes to the environment and food web mean that organisms need to move if they can, or adapt or become extinct. Organisms that live near the shore have adapted to the rise and the fall of the tide. Limpets shape their shells to fit a specific rock that effectively seals against water loss. Hermit crabs hide and scavenge shells to protect from drying out. Sea stars have tube feet that are used not only to move, but they're used to suction and anchor themselves. And pipefish are well camouflaged for eelgrass beds where they live in the lower intertidal zone. So, in this next couple of slides on PlayPosit, you're going to be answering whether you can determine if the figure is a diurnal, semi-diurnal, and mixed diurnal tides. There will also be some questions with it. Okay, and here's the answers. For number 1, it's a diurnal tide. The first low tide was at about 8 a.m. The first high tide was about 8 p.m. For figure 2 is showing a semi-diurnal tide, like we would have here. Notice that the low tides are about equal, the high tides are about equal. There's 2 during the 24-hour period, 2 high tides, 2 low tides. The first low tide was at 4 a.m., and the first high tide was at 9 a.m. Second high tide was around 9 p.m., and the second low tide was around 4 p.m. The tidal range is about 2 feet. So you need to be able to do all of those. And the last one, figure 3, shows a mixed semi-diurnal tide. There are 2 highs and 2 lows, but they are not equal. They still run somewhere around 6 hours apart, 6 to 7 hours apart. 5 to 6 hours apart. The tidal range here is 10 feet in the first tide and 4 feet in the second tide. So this is a semi-diurnal mixed tide.